Nora Hart was still wearing black from her father's funeral when her oldest brother slammed both hands onto the conference table and shouted, "You manipulated a dying old man for money." The luxury law office fell silent. Her younger brothers stared at her like she was a thief. But what shattered her wasn't the accusation. It was her husband Garrett sitting beside her, saying absolutely nothing. Then the attorney opened the will. Everything her father's estate, the company shares the Connecticut mansion, even the beach house had been left to Nora alone. And just when the room exploded into chaos, the attorney pressed play on a final video her father recorded before he died. The first thing he said was, "If Garrett Sullivan is sitting next to my daughter right now, then Nora is in more danger than she realizes. If you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you most, this story will hit harder than you expect. And by the end, you may never look at family loyalty the same way again." The silence after the video started felt heavier than the funeral itself. Nora Hart sat frozen in the leather chair, her fingers trembling in her lap, while her father's face flickered across the massive television screen inside Helen Brooks's office. The city skyline behind the glass walls glowed gray beneath the November rain, but all Nora could see was Daniel Hart's tired eyes staring straight into the camera. "If Garrett Sullivan is sitting next to my daughter right now," her father repeated weakly, "then Nora is in more danger than she realizes." The room erupted instantly. "What the hell is this?" Mason snapped, shooting to his feet. Tyler cursed under his breath while Jake laughed bitterly and shook his head. "Oh, this is unbelievable," Jake muttered. "Dad lost his damn mind before he died." But Nora barely heard them, because beside her Garrett had gone completely still, not offended, not angry, nervous. And suddenly, for the first time in 8 years of marriage, Nora noticed how quickly her husband avoided eye contact when he was hiding something. Helen Brooks calmly paused the video. "The remainder of the recording will continue after everyone settles down." "This is insane," Mason barked. "You can't legally use emotional manipulation in a will reading." Helen folded her hands neatly. "Your father documented everything thoroughly before his passing." Mason turned toward Nora with pure hatred in his eyes. "You really poisoned him against us before he died." Nora stared at him in disbelief. "I didn't do anything." "Bullshit," Tyler snapped. "You were glued to him for 2 years, because no one else was there." The words sat in Nora's throat, but exhaustion swallowed them before they could escape. She suddenly felt 90 years old. For the last 26 months, her life had revolved around hospitals' medication schedules, overnight emergency calls, and the constant fear that her father's heart would finally give out while she slept beside her phone. And through all of it, her brothers had somehow turned her sacrifice into evidence against her. The irony almost made her laugh. Almost. "You manipulated a sick old man," Mason continued coldly, "and now you get rewarded for it." Garrett finally spoke. Maybe everybody should just breathe for a second. His voice was calm, reasonable, corporate. The same voice he used during investor meetings. Not husband voice, not protective voice. Nora slowly turned toward him. He still wouldn't look at her. Helen gathered several documents neatly into a folder. "I strongly suggest nobody says anything else they may regret." "Oh, I'm past regret," Jake muttered. Nora suddenly couldn't breathe inside the room anymore. Without a word, she stood and walked out of the office. The hallway outside felt colder than Manhattan winter. She pressed trembling fingers against her mouth and closed her eyes. Then came the memories. Not because she wanted them, because grief dragged them forward whether she was ready or not. 2 years earlier. Dad, slow down. Nora laughed softly as Daniel Hart stubbornly carried grocery bags toward the kitchen himself. "I'm dying, Nora, not helpless. You're carrying soup like it's a declaration of independence." Daniel smiled faintly. Back then, the illness had still looked manageable, still survivable. The doctor spoke carefully, optimistically. Congestive heart failure, aggressive treatment, lifestyle changes, time. But time became hospitals faster than anyone expected, and eventually Nora became the only constant in his life. She drove him to every appointment, sat beside him during every scan, argued with insurance companies, stayed overnight after procedures, learned medication names she could barely pronounce. Meanwhile, her brothers sent flowers. Sometimes. Garrett hated it from the beginning. "You can't keep putting your entire life on pause," he told her one night, while loosening his tie inside their luxury apartment overlooking Central Park. Nora stood at the kitchen counter reheating soup she was too tired to eat. "He's my father. He's also sick whether you're there or not. She looked at him quietly. That sentence stayed with her for months afterward, not because it sounded cruel, because of how easy it came to him. Garrett poured himself whiskey while checking emails on his phone. You've missed 3 networking dinners this month. Nora blinked slowly. My dad almost died during surgery. And I'm aware of that, Garrett replied impatiently. But your entire world cannot become one hospital room. Nora stared at the steam rising from the soup bowl. At some point during the marriage, she had stopped expecting comfort from him. What scared her most was realizing she no longer remembered when that happened. Nora Helen Brooks's voice pulled her back to the present hallway. The attorney approached carefully, heels clicking softly against marble floors. You should come back inside. Nora wiped quickly beneath her eyes. I'm fine. Helen gave her a look that gently said, No, you aren't. There's more you need to hear. Before Nora could answer, the office door burst open again. Mason stormed out. You think you won? He hissed. Nora stared at him in shock. Excuse me? You always did this? Mason pointed at her accusingly. Act innocent while Dad treated you like some saint. I took care of him. You isolated him. Helen stepped forward sharply. That's enough. But Mason wasn't finished. You know what Dad told me 6 months ago? He snapped. He said Nora was the only person who stayed. His jaw tightened violently, like the rest of us were monsters. Nora's chest physically hurt listening to him, because underneath all the rage, there was truth. Not complete truth, but enough truth to wound. Mason looked away first, and for one split second she saw grief hiding beneath his anger. Then it disappeared again. You don't deserve any of this, he muttered before walking off. The hallway fell silent. Garrett finally emerged from the office moments later. Nora? She looked at him carefully. There it was again. Not sadness, calculation. He approached slowly. You know your father wasn't thinking clearly near the end. Something inside Nora shifted slightly. Tiny, almost invisible, but real. My father recognized every nurse by name until the day before he died, she said quietly. Garrett sighed. That's not what I mean. Then what do you mean? He lowered his voice. I mean people in that condition become emotional, vulnerable, influenceable. Nora felt cold all over. Influenceable. Was that really how Garrett saw dying people, or was that how he saw everyone? You think I manipulated him too? She asked. Garrett hesitated. Too long. And that hesitation answered everything. Nora looked at the man she married and suddenly remembered a night 3 months earlier. She had fallen asleep beside her father's hospital bed after a 14-hour emergency admission. At 2:13 a.m., she woke briefly when Garrett texted her. You still there? She replied instantly. Yeah. Rough night? Several minutes passed. Then Garrett responded. Did he ever mention what happens to the Connecticut property? At the time, exhaustion had buried the discomfort quickly. Now it returned like poison rising through water. Nora, Garrett said softly, reaching toward her arm. I'm trying to protect you from what your brothers are about to do. She stepped back instinctively, and for the first time Garrett looked genuinely unsettled. Not because she was hurting, because she was pulling away. Helen opened the office door again. We're ready to continue. Nora slowly turned back toward the conference room, toward the screen where her father waited beyond death itself. Toward truth she suddenly wasn't sure she wanted to hear, as she walked back inside Garrett's phone lit briefly in his hand. Nora only caught part of the message before he locked the screen. From Mason, she knows something. And suddenly Nora realized the betrayal inside that room might be far bigger than inheritance. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Nora walked back into the conference room. The tension had changed now. Before it was grief mixed with greed. Now it felt dangerous. Helen Brooks stood near the television with the remote still in her hand, calm and unreadable in her charcoal suit. Rain streaked down the glass windows behind her office, turning Manhattan into a blur of silver lights and shadows. Nora sat slowly beside Garrett again, but this time she left space between them. Tiny, barely noticeable. Still, Garrett noticed immediately. His jaw tightened. You're overreacting? He whispered under his breath. Nora kept her eyes forward. Am I? You saw half a text message? I also saw your face when my father mentioned you. Garrett exhaled sharply through his nose. This is exactly why emotional people shouldn't make decisions during grief. The words hit harder than he intended. Or maybe exactly as hard as he intended. Nora turned slowly toward him. Emotional people. Garrett instantly softened his expression. That's not what I meant. But it was, and both of them knew it. Before Nora could respond, Mason slammed his palm against the conference table again. Are we seriously continuing this circus? Yes, Helen replied calmly. This video proves nothing. Then you should have no issue watching it. Mason glared at her. Tyler leaned back in his chair with crossed arms, expensive watch glinting beneath the office lights. Dad was sick. People say irrational things before they die. Jake laughed bitterly from the corner. Apparently dying turns you into a poet. Nora closed her eyes briefly. This was what hurt most. Not the money. Not even the accusations. It was how quickly her brothers reduced their father's final words into inconvenience. Helen pressed play again. Daniel Hart reappeared on screen, weaker now, adjusting slightly in the hospital bed before speaking. If you boys are angry right now, he said quietly, you should ask yourselves why. Mason scoffed loudly. Daniel continued. For years I convinced myself that providing for my family was the same thing as loving them properly. His breathing sounded shallow. I paid debts, covered mistakes, protected reputations. Tyler shifted uncomfortably. Jake stared at the floor. But Nora... Daniel's voice softened instantly. Nora gave me something none of you did. Nora felt tears sting her eyes immediately. She stayed. The room went silent again. Flashbacks crashed through her mind without warning. Hospital cafeterias at midnight, her father sleeping in a recliner while machines beeped softly beside him, holding his hand after chemotherapy sessions, helping him button shirts when his hands trembled too badly. The night she drove home crying silently so nobody would worry about her too. Daniel looked directly into the camera. Do you know what your sister did after every procedure? Nobody answered. She thanked every nurse individually before leaving. Nora's throat tightened painfully. She memorized the names of janitors, cafeteria workers, receptionists. His tired eyes glistened slightly. Because kindness was the only thing she thought she had to offer people. Garrett shifted beside her. Daniel's expression darkened. And that frightened me. Now everyone was listening carefully, because women like Nora become targets. Nora's breathing slowed. Good people attract selfish people, Daniel said quietly. And selfish people mistake kindness for weakness every single time. Garrett's face hardened. Mason muttered, Jesus Christ. Daniel continued anyway. Mason came to me asking for money while I was recovering from surgery. Mason instantly stood up. That's not true. Helen calmly held up a hand. Sit down. He's twisting everything. But Daniel's voice kept playing through the speakers. Tyler wanted me to refinance property after losing money again. Tyler swore under his breath. And Jake. Daniel paused sadly. Jake only called when he disappeared too long to survive on his own. Jake's eyes suddenly filled with anger. Oh, now I'm the screw-up. No one said that, Nora whispered instinctively. Jake snapped toward her immediately. Stop acting like Mother Teresa. Nora flinched. Garrett finally spoke louder this time. Everybody needs to calm down. Jake laughed coldly. Funny. You seemed pretty calm, waiting for her inheritance, too. The room froze. Garrett's face changed instantly. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Jake smirked bitterly. You think we didn't notice you suddenly caring about Dad's investments this year? Nora slowly turned toward Garrett again. His expression became defensive immediately. Your brother is trying to start problems. But Nora remembered things now. Too many things. Garrett asking about Daniel's trust structure during dinner. Garrett suddenly encouraging family reconciliation near the end. Garrett repeatedly asking whether Nora's father updated his estate plan. At the time, every question had sounded practical. Now they sounded predatory. Daniel's voice filled the silence again. I am not leaving everything to Nora because I loved my sons less. The room stilled. I'm leaving everything to Nora because she was the only person in this family who never treated my death like a financial event. Nora broke. A sharp breath escaped her as tears slid down her face, because no one had ever defended her like that before. Not publicly, not clearly, not without conditions. Her entire life, Nora had been the peacekeeper, the fixer, the soft one, the accommodating daughter, the wife who apologized first, the sister who absorbed cruelty quietly to keep everyone comfortable. and now her dead father was the first person to say out loud what it cost her. Mason suddenly grabbed his coat. "This is bullshit," Mason Tyler started. "No." Mason pointed toward the television furiously. "He's humiliating us from the grave because she poisoned him against us." "I did not poison him," Nora said quietly. "You isolated him. I took care of him." The words exploded out of her before she could stop them. Everyone froze. Nora stood now too, breathing hard. "He called me crying after procedures because none of you answered your phones," she said shakily. "He spent Christmas Eve alone in a hospital room because Tyler was in Vegas and Jake disappeared for 2 weeks and you." She looked at Mason. "You sent flowers." Mason's face darkened instantly. "You think you're better than us?" "No," Nora whispered painfully. "I think I was there." Silence swallowed the room. Even Garrett said nothing. And suddenly Nora realized something horrifying. He had never once told her he was proud of how she cared for her father. Not once. Daniel's video continued. "If my children are fighting while watching this," he said weakly, "then I failed somewhere as a father." Helen lowered her eyes respectfully. "But I need Nora to hear this clearly." Nora's chest tightened again. "You are not difficult to love." Tears streamed down her face instantly. "You were simply surrounded by people who only loved you when you were useful to them." The room became completely still. Garrett looked away first, and that told Nora more than any confession ever could. Daniel coughed painfully on screen before continuing. "There are documents with Helen detailing financial requests, pressure attempts, and private conversations made during my illness." Mason swore loudly. Tyler suddenly looked nervous for the first time. Jake stopped smirking completely, and if anyone tries to challenge Nora legally, Daniel said carefully, "Those records will become relevant." Mason snapped. "You paranoid old man," Mason Helen warned sharply, but he was already pacing now. "This is her fault," he shouted. She sat beside him every day whispering poison into his ear while he was dying. Nora stared at him in disbelief. Then something inside her finally cracked. Not sadness, not grief. Something colder. "You know what's amazing," she said quietly. Mason frowned. "You still think Dad was too weak to think for himself?" Nora wiped tears from her cheeks slowly. "Even now." Mason opened his mouth, but the television interrupted him. Daniel looked directly into the camera one final time. "And Garrett Sullivan." Garrett visibly stiffened beside Nora. "If you're listening carefully right now, it's because you know exactly what I discovered." The color drained from Garrett's face. Nora looked at him slowly, and for the first time since marrying him, she felt afraid of the man sitting beside her. The room felt airless. Nora could hear nothing except the low, static hum of the television and the violent pounding of her own heartbeat. Beside her, Garrett's posture had completely changed. Rigid. Controlled. Too controlled. Daniel Hart's tired face flickered across the screen, while oxygen tubes rested beneath his nose. The hospital lighting softened the deep exhaustion in his features, but nothing could hide the disappointment in his eyes anymore. "And Garrett Sullivan," he repeated slowly. Garrett swallowed hard. "If you're listening carefully right now, it's because you know exactly what I discovered." Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Nora stared at the side of her husband's face, waiting for outrage, denial, something. Instead, Garrett looked like a man silently calculating damage. Daniel continued. "For a long time, I blamed myself for Nora's marriage." Garrett finally snapped. "That's enough," he said sharply, standing up. "This is inappropriate." Helen Brooks didn't move an inch. "Sit down, Mr. Sullivan. I'm not going to sit here while a dying man accuses me of a dying man." Helen interrupted coldly, who signed every legal document involved while fully competent. Garrett clenched his jaw. The room suddenly felt less like a family meeting and more like a courtroom. Daniel's voice returned through the speakers. "The first time Garrett asked me about my estate, he said weakly Nora had only been married 6 months. Nora's stomach dropped instantly. Garrett looked toward her quickly. "Your father misunderstood conversations." But Nora wasn't listening anymore, because suddenly she remembered. Their first Christmas after marriage. Daniel had invited them to Connecticut for the weekend. Garrett spent most of the evening drinking bourbon beside the fireplace while discussing investments with her father. At the time, Nora thought they were bonding. Now the memory looked different. Sharper. Ugly. Daniel coughed painfully on screen before continuing. He spoke often about security, legacy, structure. Garrett rubbed a hand across his mouth. This is insane. But never once about Nora herself. Silence crashed through the room. Nora physically felt those words, like glass entering skin, because she realized something terrifying. Her father was right. Garrett had spent years discussing her life without truly discussing her. Her emotions were reactions. Her dreams were impractical. Her exhaustion was stress management. Even her kindness had always been described like a personality flaw. Daniel shifted weakly in the hospital bed. I watched my daughter shrink inside that marriage year after year. Nora's eyes burned instantly. Flashbacks hit her one after another. Garrett correcting her stories at dinner parties. Garrett joking publicly that Nora was too sensitive for corporate life. Garrett discouraging her from accepting a promotion because it would interfere with starting a family. Garrett telling her she was lucky he handled finances because she was too emotional with money. At the time, every moment felt small. Together, they suddenly looked enormous. You know the saddest thing, Daniel asked quietly from the screen. Nora stopped asking for things. Nobody spoke. She apologized before speaking. She apologized for crying. She apologized for being tired. Nora covered her mouth as tears slid down her cheeks. Because he noticed. Her father noticed. Even while dying. Garrett exhaled sharply beside her. This is emotional manipulation. No, Helen said softly. This is a father telling the truth. Garrett turned toward Nora quickly. Your father always hated me. That's not true, Nora whispered automatically. Then she stopped. Because maybe it was, or maybe Daniel simply saw something she refused to see herself. Daniel continued speaking. When people are starving emotionally, he said weakly, they become grateful for crumbs. Nora closed her eyes. She suddenly remembered standing alone in their penthouse kitchen one night after crying in the bathroom for 20 minutes because Garrett forgot their anniversary dinner entirely. When he finally came home after midnight, he kissed her forehead distractedly and said, You know I'm under pressure right now. And she apologized. She apologized. The humiliation of that realization nearly crushed her. I don't believe Garrett married Nora for money originally, Daniel said. Garrett looked relieved for exactly half a second, but somewhere along the way he began seeing her loyalty as an asset instead of a gift. The relief vanished instantly. Nora slowly turned toward Garrett. He finally looked at her now, but not lovingly, defensively, like a businessman losing control of negotiations. That's not fair, Garrett said quietly. I worked hard for our life. Daniel answered him through the screen as though hearing him somehow across death itself. You worked hard for status. Garrett's face darkened, but Nora worked hard for people. Nobody spoke. Daniel looked exhausted now. Every sentence clearly cost him energy. I need my daughter to understand something before I'm gone. Nora leaned forward unconsciously. If someone only values you when you're useful. He paused to breathe painfully. That is not love. Nora broke completely then. Not dramatic sobbing. Not loud grief. Just silent devastation. Because somewhere deep down, a horrible part of her had known this already. Garrett touched her arm carefully. Nora. She pulled away immediately, and the look on his face afterward frightened her. Not sadness, panic, real panic. Daniel continued, There are things Helen will show Nora privately. Mason instantly looked furious again. Of course there are. Financial records, conversations, requests. Daniel's voice weakened further. Patterns. Tyler looked pale now. Jake stopped pretending not to care. And if Garrett tells Nora I was confused near the end? Garrett stood suddenly. I'm done with this. Sassy. Then Nora should ask why he's so afraid of a dead man speaking. The room froze. Garrett stared at the television in complete silence, because there was no answer to that. Helen paused the video gently. We'll continue after a short break. Mason exploded immediately. You cannot seriously expect us to sit through more of this character assassination. Helen calmly removed her glasses. Your father documented substantial concerns before his death. Concerns, Mason barked. Or Nora whispering in his ear every day. Nora finally stood slowly. I never once asked Dad for money. Mason laughed bitterly. Congratulations. No. Nora's voice shook now. I mean literally never. Silence. Do you know what I asked him during chemotherapy? She continued quietly. Nobody answered. I asked him to keep fighting. Even Jake looked uncomfortable hearing that. Nora wiped beneath her eyes. You all keep talking about the inheritance like that's what mattered most to him. Mason scoffed, but Dad spent the last year terrified. Nora's voice cracked, not of dying, of being abandoned. The room went still, because everyone knew it was true. Tyler suddenly grabbed his coat. This entire thing is disgusting. What's disgusting, Helen said sharply for the first time, is that Nora Hart spent 2 years carrying this family emotionally, while the rest of you treated Daniel Hart like an inconvenience. Tyler glared at her. Garrett stepped forward carefully. Nora, let's go home. Home. The word suddenly sounded wrong. Cold. Performative. Nora looked at him slowly, and for the first time in years, she didn't want to go with him. Garrett noticed immediately. His expression tightened. Nora. She stared at the man she once believed was safety, and suddenly all she could see was someone standing too close to her father's money, too interested, too prepared, too calm about death. Then another memory surfaced violently. 3 months earlier, Daniel asleep in his hospital room, Garrett standing quietly near the window speaking on the phone. Nora only caught one sentence before he stepped outside. Once the estate transitions, liquidity won't be a problem anymore. At the time, she assumed he meant future stability. Now her blood ran cold. Because maybe he hadn't been talking about their future. Maybe he'd been talking about his. Helen quietly handed Nora a tissue. Then she said the sentence that changed everything. Your father asked me to give you additional materials privately. Garrett turned immediately. What materials? Helen met his eyes calmly. The kind your father specifically requested you never see. And for the first time since entering the office, Garrett Sullivan looked genuinely afraid. The drive home felt unbearable. Rain hammered against the windows of Garrett's black Mercedes, while Manhattan traffic crawled endlessly beneath neon reflections and blurred headlights. Nora sat silently in the passenger seat, staring out the window while grief and suspicion twisted together inside her chest until she could barely separate one from the other. Garrett kept both hands tight on the steering wheel. Too tight. Like a man holding himself together by force. Finally, he spoke. Your father manipulated you. Nora didn't answer. He was emotional near the end, Nora. Still silence. Garrett glanced at her briefly. You know how sick people get. They become paranoid, suspicious. Nora slowly turned toward him. My father trusted me. Garrett exhaled sharply. That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? That he filled your head with things designed to isolate you? Nora stared at him quietly. Isolate you. The wording felt strangely rehearsed, almost clinical, like something he'd already practiced saying. The realization made her stomach tighten. Outside, the city lights blurred through rainwater like melting gold. Inside the car, her marriage suddenly felt colder than winter. Garrett loosened his tie with one hand. You know I loved your father. No. Nora realized something horrifying. Garrett respected her father's wealth. That wasn't the same thing. You barely visited him, she said softly. Garrett's jaw flexed. I was working. You asked about his estate more than his health? That's unfair. Is it Garrett's irritation surfaced instantly now? This is exactly the problem, Nora. Your family drags you into emotional chaos, and suddenly I'm the villain because I'm trying to think rationally. Rationally. That word again. Garrett always weaponized logic whenever emotions became inconvenient. Nora looked back toward the rain-soaked streets. 2 months earlier, she sat beside her father's hospital bed while he slept through heavy medication. Garrett arrived nearly an hour late, carrying expensive coffee and talking loudly about a business dinner. Daniel looked exhausted even before Garrett sat down. Then Garrett casually asked, So have you figured out long-term asset restructuring? Yet Nora remembered the strange silence afterward. At the time, she thought her father was simply tired. Now the memory felt contaminated. You're doing it again, Garrett said suddenly. Nora blinked. Doing what? Looking at me like I'm dangerous. The sentence sent a chill through her body, because he said it before she consciously realized it herself. Garrett noticed. He noticed her fear, and instead of comforting her, he addressed it strategically. When they finally reached the penthouse apartment, Nora felt emotionally hollow. The luxury lobby glowed with polished marble and soft piano music. Normally, the building made her feel accomplished. Tonight it felt sterile, like a showroom pretending to be a home. Garrett loosened his coat while they entered the apartment. Nora, We need to think carefully about what happens next. She froze slightly. Not what we feel, not what we lost. What happens next? Everything with Garrett was strategy, positioning, control. He poured himself whiskey immediately. Nora walked slowly toward the massive living room windows overlooking Central Park. Rain painted silver streaks across the glass, while helicopters blinked faintly above the skyline. You really think I manipulated my father? She asked quietly. Garrett took a long drink before answering. I think grief makes people vulnerable to influence. That's not what I asked. He set the glass down harder than necessary. I think your father became obsessed with the idea that everyone was using him. Nora folded her arms tightly around herself. Were they? Garrett stared at her, and for one dangerous second his mask slipped. Only slightly, but enough. Enough for Nora to see annoyance instead of heartbreak, then it vanished again. You're exhausted, Garrett said carefully, and right now your brothers are looking for someone to blame. My father blamed you too. Garrett laughed softly in disbelief. A dead man accuses me on video and suddenly that's evidence. Nora looked at him quietly. If the accusations are ridiculous, why are you so angry? That landed. Garrett's face hardened instantly. I'm angry because your family is destroying itself and you're too emotional to see what's happening. There it was again. Too emotional, too sensitive, too reactive. The phrases came so naturally to him, like he'd spent years shrinking her carefully one sentence at a time. Nora suddenly felt tired in a way sleep could never fix. I'm going to shower, she whispered. Garrett nodded stiffly. Good idea. But halfway down the hallway she stopped, because Garrett had already picked up his phone. His voice lowered instantly. Yeah, he muttered. She's starting to question things. Nora froze silently behind the corner wall. A pause. No, not yet. Another pause. I know what Daniel said. Her blood turned cold. Garrett lowered his voice further. We need to stay calm until I figure out what Helen actually has. Nora stopped breathing, because this wasn't fear, this was coordination. Her husband wasn't shocked by the accusations. He was managing fallout. Footsteps approached suddenly. Nora hurried into the bathroom before Garrett could see her standing there. Her hands trembled violently while she locked the door behind her. Then she looked at herself in the mirror. Mascara stains, pale skin, exhausted eyes, and suddenly she barely recognized the woman staring back. When was the last time she felt emotionally safe inside her own marriage? The question terrified her because she didn't know the answer. Steam filled the bathroom while hot water poured over her skin, but nothing softened the cold inside her chest. Memories kept returning now, little moments she ignored before. Garrett discouraging her from opening separate savings accounts because married couples shouldn't divide resources. Garrett insisting she quit therapy after only 3 sessions because those people just create problems. Garrett mocking her nonprofit career as charity work for rich women. Each memory alone felt survivable. Together they formed something darker, something systematic. After the shower, Nora stepped quietly into the bedroom. Garrett was downstairs on another call. She could hear his faint voice drifting upward. I said, give me time. A dangerous instinct surfaced suddenly. Nora moved toward Garrett's office. Her pulse thundered painfully. This is wrong. But something deeper answered immediately. So is everything else. The office smelled like leather cologne and expensive coffee. Garrett's laptop sat open on the desk, unlocked. Nora hesitated only a second before touching the trackpad. Folders filled the screen. Financial reports, client files, investment projections. Then one folder caught her attention instantly. Hart Asset Recovery. Nora's chest tightened violently. She clicked it open. Spreadsheets, property evaluations, projected liquidity estimates, future transfer models. Daniel's estate listed line by line. Nora felt physically nauseous. Some files were dated nearly a year earlier. A year. Garrett had been planning around her father's death while Daniel was still alive. Tears burned behind Nora's eyes again, but this time they weren't grief. They were humiliation. She kept scrolling. Then she saw another document. Post-transition strategy. Her fingers shook opening it. Inside were notes. If Nora receives controlling shares leads to leverage emotional dependency. Encourage fast liquidation before brothers challenge estate. Reallocate capital towards Sullivan Capital recovery phase. Nora stopped breathing. Recovery phase. Garrett's company. This was never about protecting her. Her inheritance was his bailout plan. Suddenly footsteps echoed faintly downstairs. Nora panicked and closed folders quickly. Then another file caught her eye before she shut the laptop completely. Monthly apartment payments, Chicago, Illinois, luxury residential leasing, recipient Chloe Bennett. Nora frowned. Who was Chloe Bennett? The sound of Garrett approaching the staircase snapped her back instantly. She closed the laptop just before he entered the hallway. Nora. She turned slowly. Garrett studied her face carefully. Too carefully. You okay? For the first time in years? Nora almost said no, but instinct still protected him automatically. Just tired, she whispered. Garrett approached and kissed her forehead gently. The gesture felt empty now, performative, like muscle memory pretending to be intimacy. As he walked away again, Nora stared toward his office silently, then toward the city lights beyond the windows. And deep in her gut, she knew one terrible thing with certainty. Her father hadn't been paranoid. He had been trying to warn her before it was too late. Nora didn't sleep at all that night. She lay beside Garrett in the darkness while Manhattan glowed beyond the bedroom windows, her body stiff beneath silk sheets that suddenly felt unfamiliar against her skin. Every sound from Garrett felt amplified now, the slow rhythm of his breathing, the occasional turn of his body, the soft vibration of his phone lighting up on the nightstand at 2:17 a.m. Nora kept her eyes closed. Garrett quietly picked up the phone. A long pause followed. Then came the glow of the bathroom light beneath the door. He took the call somewhere she couldn't hear him. And that silence terrified her more than shouting ever could. By morning, Nora had already made her decision. She needed to know who Chloe Bennett was. Not eventually. Now. Garrett stood in the kitchen making espresso while CNBC played softly in the background. The entire apartment looked pristine, elegant, controlled. Just like him. You should stay home today, Garrett said casually. You're emotionally overloaded. Emotionally overloaded. Nora almost laughed. I have some things to handle. Garrett glanced at her over his coffee mug. Like what? The question came too quickly, too sharply. Nora grabbed her coat calmly. Funeral paperwork. His shoulders relaxed slightly. I can help with that. No, she said softly. I'd rather do it alone. Something flickered across Garrett's face again. Not concern, suspicion. But it disappeared behind his polished smile almost instantly. Okay? He walked toward her slowly and kissed her cheek. The affection felt mechanical now, like a rehearsed movement in a marriage neither of them fully occupied anymore. Call me if you need anything, he said. Nora nodded, but inside something cold had started growing quietly, because for the first time in years, she no longer believed him. 3 hours later, Nora sat alone on a flight to Chicago. Rain clouds stretched endlessly outside the airplane window, while anxiety twisted painfully through her stomach. Part of her still hoped this was all some terrible misunderstanding. Maybe Chloe Bennett was a client, an employee, a consultant. Anything except what Nora feared. But deep down, she already knew. Women always know long before they admit it to themselves. The luxury apartment address from Garrett's files led her to a high-rise overlooking Lake Michigan. Glass walls, private valet, the kind of building Garrett always admired. Nora stood outside for several seconds trying to steady her breathing before finally entering the lobby. Can I help you? The receptionist asked politely. Nora forced a smile. I'm here to see Chloe Bennett. The receptionist checked quickly. 38th floor. Nora's pulse thundered as the elevator climbed. 38 floors. 38 chances to turn around. But grief had burned something open inside her now, and once truth begins, surfacing lies become impossible to survive. The elevator doors opened into a private hallway lined with modern art and soft lighting. Nora knocked carefully. Footsteps approached. Then the door opened. The woman standing there looked younger than Nora expected. Mid-30s, beautiful in an effortless way, soft blonde hair loosely tied back, cashmere sweater, bare feet against polished hardwood floors. And the second Chloe smiled warmly at her, Nora's heart shattered, because this woman had no idea who she was opening the door to. Oh, Chloe said politely. Hi? Nora suddenly forgot how to breathe. I'm sorry, Chloe continued. Were you looking for someone? Nora stared at her silently for one unbearable second before speaking. Garrett Sullivan. Everything changed instantly. The color drained from Chloe's face. The silence between them became suffocating. Then Chloe whispered, "Oh my God." Nora felt humiliation crawl through her body so violently she almost physically staggered. Not because Garrett cheated, because another woman looked at her with pity. Chloe stepped backwards slowly. "You're Nora." It wasn't a question. Nora nodded once. For several seconds, neither woman moved. Then Chloe quietly said, "You should come inside." The apartment was stunning. Modern furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows, fresh flowers near the kitchen island, expensive wine bottles Garrett once claimed were too overpriced to buy regularly. Nora noticed male dress shirts hanging partially from a bedroom chair, Garrett's favorite brand. Her chest tightened so painfully she thought she might actually collapse. "I didn't know," Chloe said quickly. "I swear to God, I didn't know." Nora sat slowly on the couch because her legs suddenly felt weak. "What exactly didn't you know?" Chloe looked devastated. "He told me your marriage was basically over." Nora laughed softly. The sound barely resembled laughter at all. "Basically over." Chloe's eyes filled immediately. "He said you stayed together because of your father's illness and public appearances." Public appearances, of course. Everything with Garrett revolved around appearances. Nora stared blankly toward the massive windows overlooking Chicago. "How long?" Chloe hesitated. "Too long." Nora closed her eyes briefly. "How long?" "Chloe." "Almost a year." "A year." Nora physically felt those words inside her chest. A year of hospital visits, funeral planning, crying quietly in bathrooms so nobody would feel uncomfortable around her grief. Meanwhile, Garrett built another relationship in another city. The humiliation felt endless. "I'm sorry," Chloe whispered again. Nora looked at her carefully now, and suddenly something unexpected happened. She didn't hate her, because Chloe didn't look smug. She looked destroyed, manipulated, used, just like Nora. "He said he was going to divorce you after everything with your father settled," Chloe admitted shakily. Nora swallowed hard. "What does that mean?" Chloe looked confused. The inheritance situation. There it was. The center of everything. Money. Nora suddenly remembered Garrett asking detailed questions about Daniel's estate structure only weeks after diagnosis. At the time, she thought he cared about protecting their future. Now she realized he was studying opportunity. Chloe stood slowly. "I should show you something." Nora's stomach tightened instantly. Chloe picked up her phone and opened old messages, then handed it over silently. Nora's hands shook reading them. Garrett. "Once Daniel passes, things become simpler. Garrett Nora gets emotional about family. I handle the practical side. Garrett. After the estate clears, I can finally focus on our future properly." Nora stopped breathing. Their future. Not his marriage, not grief, not her pain. Their future. With another woman. Tears blurred her vision instantly, but she kept reading anyway. Because pain becomes addictive once truth enters it. Another message. Garrett. Just be patient a little longer. The inheritance changes everything. Nora lowered the phone slowly. The room tilted slightly around her. All this time she thought she was holding her family together while her father died. Meanwhile, her husband was privately planning a new life funded by her grief. "How sick was your father near the end?" Chloe asked quietly. Nora looked up sharply. "Why?" Chloe hesitated nervously. "Because Garrett talked about timelines sometimes." The word hit Nora like a slap. Timelines. Not life. Not death. Timelines. As though Daniel Hart was merely an obstacle delaying financial transition. Nora suddenly stood and walked toward the window, wrapping her arms around herself tightly. Lake Michigan stretched endlessly beneath gray skies, while cold light filled the apartment. "You know what the worst part is," Nora whispered. Chloe stayed silent. "I would have given that man everything." Her voice cracked completely now. "I already did." The silence afterward felt unbearably intimate. Then Chloe spoke quietly behind her. "There's more." Nora turned slowly. Chloe looked terrified now. "He talked to someone constantly after your father got worse." Nora's pulse quickened. "Who I don't know. But—" Chloe swallowed nervously. "Sometimes he mentioned your brothers." Everything inside Nora went cold. Chloe stepped forward carefully. "And Nora?" Nora stared at her. "There are voice messages, too. Nora replayed the voice message 3 times on the flight back to New York. Each time Garrett's voice sounded colder, crueler, more real. "She'll never leave," he said casually through Chloe's phone speaker. "Nora's too loyal for that." The background noise suggested he was in a restaurant. Glasses clinking, quiet laughter nearby. Another pause. Honestly, her entire identity revolves around taking care of people. She doesn't even know who she is outside of that. Nora stared blankly out the airplane window while the words hollowed something inside her. Not because they were entirely false, but because Garrett had studied her weaknesses carefully enough to weaponize them. That was the part that hurt most. He knew exactly how much pain she would tolerate before breaking, and he trusted she would tolerate more. By the time the plane landed, Nora no longer felt like the same woman who boarded it. Grief still lived inside her, but something else had joined it now. Clarity. Cold and terrifying clarity. The Hart family dinner happened 2 nights later. Mason insisted everyone gather at the Connecticut estate to discuss the future like adults. Translation: pressure. Nora into surrendering the inheritance. The mansion looked haunting at night now. Daniel Hart's absence filled every hallway like smoke. The long dining table glowed beneath chandeliers, while rain tapped softly against tall windows overlooking the dark property. Nora sat quietly between Garrett and Helen Brooks. Across from her sat Mason Tyler and Jake, 3 brothers dressed like successful men. 3 sons who suddenly looked more nervous than grieving. Wine was poured, nobody drank much. Finally, Mason leaned back in his chair. So he said casually, "How long are we pretending Dad's will make any sense?" There it was. Straight to business. Nora calmly folded her napkin in her lap. Dad made his decision. He made that decision while isolated and manipulated. Helen looked unimpressed. "Careful, Mason." Tyler cut in quickly. "No offense, Helen, but you were financially benefiting from keeping Dad emotionally dependent too." Helen nearly smiled. That accusation would be more intimidating if your father hadn't documented literally everything. Tyler looked away immediately. Interesting. Nora noticed every reaction carefully now. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to keep everyone comfortable. She was observing them, and suddenly patterns appeared everywhere. Jake poured more whiskey aggressively. Mason kept checking Garrett's expression before speaking. Tyler avoided direct eye contact any time Daniel's name came up. The entire dinner felt coordinated. Garrett reached for Nora's hand beneath the table. She moved hers first. The flicker of irritation on his face lasted less than a second, but she saw it. "So, what's your plan?" Jake asked coldly. "Keep everything." Nora looked at him calmly. "Dad trusted me with it?" Mason laughed bitterly. "No, Dad punished us with it." "Maybe ask yourself why," Nora replied quietly. The table went silent instantly, because old Nora never answered back. Garrett immediately stepped in. "Nora doesn't mean yes." Nora interrupted softly. "I do." Garrett stared at her. So did everyone else. For the first time in years, Nora allowed silence to stay uncomfortable instead of rescuing everyone from it. Mason leaned forward slowly. "You think you're morally superior because you played nurse." The cruelty in his tone would have crushed her a month ago. Now it mostly exhausted her. "I took care of Dad because he was sick. You enjoyed controlling access to him." "No," Nora said calmly. "You just stopped visiting once he stopped financing your mistakes." Tyler slammed his glass down. "That's bullshit, is it?" Nora asked. Jake scoffed loudly. "You've always judged us." Nora almost laughed. Judged them? She spent her entire life defending them, covering for them, excusing them. She remembered Mason missing Thanksgiving because of another business emergency that was actually a gambling problem. Tyler borrowing money from Daniel after losing nearly everything in a failed startup. Jake disappearing for months after another rehab relapse. And every single time, Nora became the emotional translator cleaning up the damage afterward. "They're trying," she used to tell Daniel. "They'll come around. They don't mean it." But deep down, she had spent years begging reality to become softer than it truly was. Garrett cleared his throat carefully. "Maybe we should focus on solutions." Nora turned slowly toward him. Solutions. Again. Always solutions. Never accountability, never truth. Mason nodded quickly. "Exactly." Tyler leaned back. "Nobody's saying Nora shouldn't inherit something." Something. Jake smirked faintly. "But all of it. Come on." Nora studied their faces carefully. None of them were mourning anymore. They were negotiating. And suddenly her father's words echoed violently inside her mind. She was the only person who never treated my death like a financial event. Garrett spoke smoothly beside her. Nora understands fairness matters. Nora looked at him. Really looked at him. The expensive watch, perfect posture, controlled voice, the polished corporate charm she once mistook for stability. Now she saw something else underneath it. Entitlement. Garrett genuinely believed he deserved influence over her inheritance. And worse, he believed Nora was too emotionally dependent to resist him. The realization made her strangely calm. "You already discussed this together, didn't you?" Nora asked quietly. The room froze. Mason frowned. "Discuss what you and Garrett." Nobody answered immediately. That was answer enough. Garrett smiled carefully. "Nora, you're spiraling." There it was. The manipulation. Instantly framing her perception as emotional instability. But this time, Nora saw it happen in real time. And once manipulation becomes visible, it loses power. "No," she said softly. "I'm finally paying attention." Garrett's jaw tightened. Tyler scoffed. "You sound paranoid." Nora almost smiled. Paranoid. The same word Garrett used about Daniel. Interesting. "Did you know Garrett had financial projections for Dad's estate saved on his laptop?" Nora asked calmly. Silence exploded across the room. Garrett turned pale instantly. "What I saw the files." "Nora. You modeled asset transfers before my father was even dead." Jake looked sharply toward Garrett. Mason swore under his breath. Tyler suddenly looked nervous, and Nora noticed something important immediately. They weren't shocked enough. Garrett forced a laugh. "I work in finance. I model scenarios constantly." Did Chloe Bennett fit into those scenarios too? Everything stopped. Completely. Garrett's face emptied of color. Mason looked confused. Jake blinked. "Who the hell is Chloe?" Garrett stood abruptly. "Nora, enough." The authority in his voice almost made old instincts kick in. Apologize. De-escalate. Make peace. But Nora stayed seated, calm, still, powerful. "You told her our marriage was basically over," Nora said quietly. Garrett's breathing sharpened. "Nora, this is not the place." "No," she replied softly. "This family specializes in pretending things aren't happening." Mason stared between them. "Wait. You cheated on her?" Garrett snapped immediately. "Stay out of my marriage." Jake laughed bitterly. "Jesus Christ." Tyler leaned forward slowly now. "Garrett, tell me you weren't stupid enough to do this while all this inheritance stuff was happening?" Nora noticed it instantly. Not concern for her, concern for the money. Garrett noticed too, and suddenly the polished image holding the room together started cracking. "Nobody knows what this marriage has been like," Garrett snapped. Nora stared at him in disbelief. Marriage? Not affair? Not betrayal? Marriage. He still framed himself as the victim. "You're unbelievable," Nora whispered. Garrett stepped closer toward her. "After everything I've done for you?" Nora laughed softly. A broken sound. "Done for me." Her voice trembled now, but not from weakness, from awakening. "You mean managing me?" The room went silent again. Garrett's expression darkened. "Nora, you called me emotional every time I questioned you." "Nora, stop. You made me feel guilty for grieving my father." "I said stop." "You talked about his death like a business merger." Garrett suddenly slammed both palms against the dining table. Because somebody had to think practically, the outburst echoed violently through the dining room. Nobody moved, and for the first time, everyone saw him clearly. Not calm, not sophisticated, not controlled. Just angry that his control was slipping away. Nora looked at him quietly. Then she reached into her purse and placed her phone on the table. "I recorded this entire dinner," she said softly. Garrett froze. "So choose your next words carefully." Nobody spoke after Nora placed the phone on the dining table. The silence felt electric. Garrett stared at the device like it was a weapon. And maybe it was. Because for the first time in years, Nora was no longer absorbing everyone else's damage quietly. She was documenting it. Jake leaned back slowly in his chair. "Well, this dinner got interesting." "Turn that off," Garrett said coldly. Nora held his gaze evenly. Why you secretly recorded private conversations. You secretly built another relationship while planning around my father's death. Garrett's jaw tightened violently. That's not the same thing. No, Nora replied softly. It's worse. Mason suddenly stood up. I'm not sitting here for marriage drama. Marriage drama. The phrase almost made Nora laugh, as though betrayal became smaller if labeled casually enough. Helen Brooks calmly gathered several documents beside her plate. Actually, I think everyone should stay seated. Tyler frowned. Why? Helen slid a sealed envelope across the table toward Nora. The room instantly went still. Nora looked down slowly. Her name was written across the front in Daniel Hart's unmistakable handwriting. For Nora alone. Her chest tightened immediately. Garrett noticed too. What is that? Helen met his eyes calmly. Something your father instructed me to deliver privately. Mason scoffed. More emotional manipulation from beyond the grave? Helen ignored him completely. Nora, she said gently, your father prepared this 6 weeks before his passing. Nora's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the envelope. The paper felt strangely heavy, like holding the final heartbeat of someone she loved. You can read it later, Helen added softly. But Nora already knew she wouldn't wait. Not after everything. She carefully opened the envelope. Inside sat a handwritten letter and a small flash drive. The sight alone nearly broke her, because suddenly she remembered her father sitting alone in hospital rooms, preparing for a future he knew he wouldn't survive, preparing to protect her after death, while everyone else prepared for inheritance. Nora unfolded the letter slowly. Her vision blurred instantly at the first line. Sweetheart, if you're reading this, it means things became uglier than I hoped. Tears burned her eyes immediately. The dining room disappeared around her as she kept reading silently. I know you. You're probably trying to keep everyone together right now. You always do. Nora swallowed painfully. Across the table, Garrett watched her carefully. Not lovingly. Strategically. Daniel's words continued, but kindness without boundaries becomes self-destruction. Nora stopped breathing for a second. Because no one had ever said that to her before. Not once in her life. Her entire identity revolved around endurance. Being patient enough, soft enough, forgiving enough, useful enough. Daniel understood that. And suddenly she realized he may have understood it better than she did herself. You were raised to believe love means sacrifice, but sacrifice only matters when the other person would sacrifice too. Nora lowered the letter, slightly overwhelmed. Memories hit her one after another. Garrett mocking her nonprofit work while spending thousands entertaining investors. Garrett rolling his eyes when she cried after difficult hospital visits. Garrett telling her she was too intense emotionally whenever she asked for affection. And every single time. She adjusted herself smaller to keep the relationship peaceful. You okay? Jake asked awkwardly. Nora ignored him. Her father's words mattered more than anyone in that room now. I need you to understand something very clearly. If someone benefits from your silence, they will train you to stay silent. A chill ran through Nora's entire body, because Garrett had done exactly that. Not loudly, not violently, quietly, patiently, year after year. You don't need to read this here, Garrett interrupted carefully. Nora looked up slowly. The concern in his voice sounded practiced now. Daniel's letter continued in her trembling hands. Garrett asked me privately once whether you would fall apart emotionally after I died. The room disappeared. Nora physically stopped breathing. Her eyes lifted toward Garrett immediately. His face changed. Just slightly. But enough. Enough to confirm it was true. You talked to my father about me like that, Nora whispered. Garrett instantly stepped forward. Nora, that conversation was taken out of context. What context makes that acceptable? I was worried about you. No, Nora said quietly. You were evaluating me. The table went silent again. Helen lowered her eyes. Even Mason looked uncomfortable now. Nora kept reading. I saw the way Garrett studied people, especially vulnerable people, noticed what they feared, what they needed, what made them easier to control. Nora's chest hurt so badly she almost couldn't continue, because suddenly dozens of moments rearranged themselves into something horrifyingly clear. Garrett discouraging therapy, Garrett controlling financial conversations, Garrett minimizing her instincts whenever she questioned him, Garrett convincing her sensitivity made her irrational. It wasn't care, it was conditioning. Nora, Garrett said carefully, your father was suspicious of everyone near the end. But Nora finally heard the pattern. Every time truth surfaced, Garrett attacked perception itself. Confused, emotional, paranoid, manipulated, anything except honest. Her father's letter continued. I stayed quiet longer than I should have because I hoped I was wrong about him, but good men do not make women feel small to remain lovable. Nora closed her eyes. That sentence shattered something inside her completely, because she had spent years becoming smaller. Smaller needs, smaller emotions, smaller expectations, and Garrett always seemed most comfortable when she disappeared emotionally. The final lines of the letter nearly destroyed her. You do not owe your life to people simply because they are family, and you do not owe loyalty to someone who survives by draining yours. For the first time in your life, Nora, choose yourself. Love. Dad. Silence swallowed the room completely. Nora folded the letter carefully with shaking fingers. Nobody moved. Nobody knew what to say. Because Daniel Hart had exposed something bigger than inheritance now. He exposed the emotional architecture of Nora's entire life. Garrett finally stepped closer again. Nora, please listen to me. She looked up slowly, and for the first time since marrying him, she saw no safety in his face at all. Only management, only panic, only a man losing access to something valuable. What exactly were you waiting for? Nora asked quietly. Garrett frowned. What? My father to die. Her voice cracked slightly. The estate transfer. The divorce. That's not fair. No. Nora whispered. Fair would have been honesty. Mason suddenly pushed his chair back roughly. This is insane. Tyler rubbed both hands across his face. Jesus Christ. Jake looked deeply uncomfortable now. Garrett reached toward Nora carefully. She stepped back immediately, and that tiny movement changed everything. Because Garrett finally understood. She wasn't emotionally trapped anymore. Fear flashed across his face instantly. Real fear. Helen quietly spoke for the first time in several minutes. Nora, she said gently, there's also a video on that flash drive. Nora looked down at it slowly. A private message from your father. Garrett's expression darkened immediately. What else did Daniel leave? Helen met his eyes calmly. The truth. And suddenly Nora realized something important. Her father hadn't left her money. He left her permission. Permission to stop abandoning herself just to keep toxic people comfortable. The mansion felt different after dinner ended. Not quieter, emptier. Like the walls themselves had finally stopped pretending the Hart family was still whole. Nora stood alone inside Daniel Hart's study while midnight rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking the dark Connecticut property. The room still smelled faintly like cedarwood old books and the black coffee her father drank every morning for 30 years. She used to feel safe here. Tonight she felt awake. The flash drive sat in her hand while Garrett's angry voice echoed faintly somewhere downstairs arguing with Mason. For once Nora didn't rush to stop conflict. She closed the study door instead, locked it, then sat slowly in her father's leather chair. The laptop screen glowed softly as she inserted the drive. One video file appeared. private_4_ Nora.mp4. Her chest tightened painfully. Nora clicked play. Daniel appeared on screen again, weaker than before. This video was clearly recorded later. His face looked thinner, more tired, but his eyes still held warmth whenever he looked into the camera. Hi, sweetheart. Nora immediately covered her mouth, because suddenly she wasn't a betrayed wife or an unwanted sister anymore. She was just someone's daughter again, and she missed him so badly she could barely survive it. If you're watching this, Daniel said gently, then I'm gone, and things probably became ugly exactly the way I feared. Nora wiped tears from her face silently. I know you're overwhelmed right now. A faint smile crossed his tired features. You always think it's your job to hold everyone together. Nora looked down immediately. Because it was true. Her entire life revolved around emotional maintenance. Keep the peace, calm the tension, absorb the damage, protect everyone else from discomfort, even if it destroyed her quietly. Daniel sighed softly on screen. I need you to hear something carefully this time, Nora. She looked back up. Love should feel safe. The sentence shattered her instantly, because she couldn't remember the last time her marriage felt safe. Predictable, yes. Polished, yes. Functional, yes, but safe. No. Daniel leaned back weakly against the hospital pillows. When your mother was alive, he continued softly. She used to say something I never fully understood until I watched your marriage. Nora's chest tightened. She said women like you mistake endurance for love. Tears slid silently down Nora's cheeks. She worried you'd spend your whole life proving your worth to people who already decided to undervalue you. The words landed deep, painfully deep, because Nora suddenly remembered being 14 years old, standing in this exact study after Mason screamed at her for touching his car keys. She cried quietly while her mother brushed hair away from her face and whispered, "You don't have to earn softness from people who love you." At the time, Nora didn't understand. Now she finally did. Daniel's expression darkened slightly. I investigated Garrett quietly during my last year alive. Nora froze, and what I found frightened me. Downstairs voices suddenly rose louder. Garrett, Mason, arguing. Nora barely heard them. Daniel continued. Garrett's company was collapsing faster than he admitted publicly. Nora stared at the screen. He wasn't desperate yet, Daniel said weakly, but he was heading there. Suddenly, Garrett's constant obsession with timing made terrifying sense. The inheritance wasn't luxury, it was rescue. Daniel coughed painfully before continuing. And desperate people become dangerous when they believe someone else owes them survival. Nora's breathing slowed, because for the first time she understood Garrett's behavior wasn't random cruelty. It was entitlement. He believed Nora existed to stabilize his life emotionally and financially, and she had spent years helping him believe it. Daniel looked directly into the camera now. I need you to stop confusing pity with loyalty. Nora closed her eyes, because she pitied Garrett constantly. His stress, his pressure, his expectations, his childhood, his career. Every wound he carried became Nora's responsibility somehow. Meanwhile, nobody asked who carried hers. Daniel's voice softened again. You know what terrified me most? Nora opened her eyes slowly. That Garrett never looked afraid of losing you emotionally. Her chest tightened sharply. He only looked afraid of losing control of your devotion. The truth of it nearly suffocated her. Because even during dinner tonight, Garrett didn't seem heartbroken. He seemed destabilized, like a business model failing unexpectedly. Suddenly pounding footsteps echoed upstairs. Nora muted the laptop instantly. A knock hit the study door. Nora, Garrett. She stayed silent. Another knock. Nora opened the door. The calmness in his voice sounded forced now, managed. She slowly stood and unlocked the study. Garrett entered immediately. His expensive suit jacket was gone. His tie loosened, his composure cracked around the edges. Nora, we need to talk privately. She stepped back quietly. You mean manipulate me privately? His face hardened instantly. Is that really what you think of me now? Nora almost answered immediately. But then she stopped, because something strange had changed inside her. For years, Garrett trained her to react emotionally while he stayed controlled. Now the balance shifted. She was calm, and he wasn't. You lied to me for over a year, she said softly. Garrett rubbed a hand across his face. Things with Chloe got complicated. Complicated. Nora stared at him. What a small word for betrayal. You discussed my father's death with another woman. That's not fair. Fair, Nora laughed softly. You had financial projections for my grief. Garrett stepped closer. I was trying to secure our future. No, Nora whispered. You were securing yours. Silence stretched between them. Rain hammered harder against the windows. Finally, Garrett spoke quietly. You think you're innocent in this? Nora frowned slightly. You disappeared into your father's illness for 2 years. The words hit hard. Every conversation became about hospitals, medication, stress. Garrett's frustration surfaced openly now. You stopped being my wife long before Chloe happened. For one painful second, guilt stabbed through Nora automatically. Old instincts, internalized blame. Then something incredible happened. She saw the manipulation while it was happening, clear as glass. Garrett cheated, Garrett lied. Garrett planned around her inheritance. And somehow, he still redirected emotional responsibility back onto her. You abandoned me emotionally, he continued. Nora looked at him quietly. No, she said softly. I was taking care of my dying father. Garrett exhaled sharply. You always make yourself the victim. That sentence used to destroy her. Tonight it made her tired. Because suddenly Nora realized something freeing. People who exploit kindness often accuse kind people of manipulation the moment boundaries appear. Garrett stepped closer again. Nora, listen to me carefully. She waited silently. I know you're hurt right now, but your brothers will destroy you if you try handling this alone. There it was. Fear, dependency, control. You need me. Nora stared at him for several long seconds. Then she quietly answered no. The word visibly shook him. Not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. Garrett blinked slowly, as though he genuinely never imagined hearing it from her. Downstairs, a door slammed somewhere in the mansion. Wind rattled the old windows, and for the first time in nearly a decade, Nora Hart no longer felt emotionally owned by the man standing in front of her. But Garrett wasn't finished, because after several seconds of silence, his expression changed completely. Cold, careful, dangerous. Then he quietly said, If you turn against me now, Nora, your brothers won't be the only people you should worry about. The threat stayed in Nora's head long after Garrett left the study. If you turn against me now, Nora, your brothers won't be the only people you should worry about. The sentence replayed over and over while rain battered the mansion windows through the early morning hours. Not because Garrett raised his voice, because he didn't. That calmness frightened her more. For years, Nora mistook Garrett's emotional control for maturity. Now she realized something darker. Controlled people could still be cruel. Sometimes they were cruelest when perfectly calm. Nora barely slept. At sunrise, the Connecticut estate looked ghostly beneath pale gray skies. The gardens her mother once loved sat drenched in rainwater, while fog rolled slowly across the massive lawn. The house felt full of memories and secrets. Nora sat alone at the kitchen island clutching coffee that had already gone cold when Helen Brooks entered quietly carrying a leather briefcase. You're awake early, Helen said gently. Nora gave a hollow laugh. I don't think I slept. Helen studied her carefully. Then she sat beside her. For what it's worth, she said softly, your father would be very proud of how you handled yourself last night. Nora stared into her coffee silently. I don't feel strong. Most truly strong people don't. The kindness in Helen's voice almost broke her, because kindness without expectation suddenly felt unfamiliar now. Helen slowly opened the briefcase. There are things you need to see. Nora's stomach tightened immediately. Helen placed several folders on the marble countertop. Financial statements, legal documents, bank transfers. This is part of what your father documented privately before his death. Nora carefully opened the first file. Her heartbeat slowed painfully. Large financial transfers connected Garrett's company to Shell consulting accounts. Some included Mason and Tyler's signatures. Nora blinked slowly. What is this? Helen folded her hands carefully. Your father hired forensic accountants after becoming suspicious. Suspicious. The word no longer sounded paranoid, it sounded intelligent. Nora kept turning pages, consulting fees, emergency transfers, debt restructuring. Then she saw it. A flagged note highlighted in red. Attempted leverage discussion regarding Hart Medical inheritance projections. Her chest tightened violently. They were planning around my father's death together, she whispered. Helen nodded slowly. We believe Garrett's company began collapsing nearly 18 months ago. Nora sat back numbly. 18 months. That meant while she was driving Daniel to chemotherapy appointments? Garrett was privately strategizing survival through her inheritance. A sick feeling rose in Nora's stomach. Not just betrayal, calculation. Her grief had become someone else's financial opportunity. Helen slid another document toward her. This one matters most. Nora looked down. A private legal memo. Prepared by Daniel Hart. Subject concerns regarding coercion attempts. Nora's fingers trembled opening it. Inside were dated summaries of conversations. Mason requesting emergency money after gambling losses. Tyler pressuring Daniel to refinance property. Jake threatening to disappear permanently unless debts were covered. And Garrett? Nora stopped breathing. Private dinner with Garrett Sullivan. Questions focused primarily on estate liquidity structure and timeline accessibility. Repeated concern regarding whether Nora maintains emotional resilience under pressure. Nora closed her eyes immediately. Timeline accessibility. God. Garrett really had been waiting. Tears burned her eyes again, but this time rage mixed with grief, because suddenly she understood why her father looked so heartbroken near the end. He wasn't just dying. He was watching people circle his death financially. "You said there was more?" Nora asked quietly. Helen hesitated, then she handed over another file. "Nora, I need you to prepare yourself emotionally before reading this." Fear slid coldly through her chest. Inside the folder were copies of legal competency concerns filed against Daniel months before his death. Nora frowned immediately. "What is this?" Helen's expression darkened. "Someone attempted to establish concerns regarding your father's mental capacity." The room went still. Nora read further. Claims suggesting confusion, emotional instability, poor decision-making. Her stomach dropped, because she recognized the language instantly. It was the exact same language Garrett used against her. Emotional, unstable, influenced, too sensitive. The vocabulary of control. "Who filed this?" Nora whispered. Helen stayed silent for one painful second too long, then answered. "Mason initiated it." Nora physically recoiled. "No, I'm sorry." "No, he wouldn't. He did." Nora stared blankly at the papers. Mason, her oldest brother, the one who gave speeches at charity galas about family values, the one who cried publicly at the funeral, the one who accused Nora of manipulation. He tried legally positioning their dying father as mentally incompetent. Why? Then the answer hit immediately: to challenge the will later. Nora suddenly stood and walked toward the window because she couldn't breathe sitting down anymore. Outside, rain dripped slowly from dead autumn branches. The estate looked colder than ever. "My father knew?" she asked quietly. Helen nodded. "He found out shortly before his final hospitalization." Nora covered her mouth. That explained everything. Daniel's sadness, his withdrawal, the exhaustion in his eyes whenever family visited near the end. He wasn't just physically dying, he was emotionally devastated. "He still protected them?" Nora whispered painfully. "Yes," Helen replied softly, "until the very end. That destroyed her most." Daniel still loved his sons despite everything, even while they treated him like access to wealth. Nora turned back slowly. "What happens now?" Helen's expression became careful. "That depends on you." Nora frowned slightly. "You have enough evidence to pursue legal action if necessary." The words echoed heavily. Legal action. Against her husband. Against her brothers. Against the people she spent her entire life protecting emotionally. A part of her still recoiled from it automatically. Not because they deserved protection, because Nora had been trained to fear conflict more than mistreatment. Helen seemed to notice the war happening inside her. "Nora," she said gently, "your father spent months terrified you would sacrifice yourself to keep peace with people actively exploiting you." Nora looked down silently, because it was true. Even now, part of her still wanted everyone to stop fighting. Even now, part of her wanted to rescue Garrett from consequences. That realization disgusted her. "How do you stop loving people who hurt you?" Nora whispered. Helen's face softened sadly. "You don't always stop immediately." Silence settled between them. But eventually Helen continued quietly. "You start loving yourself enough to stop participating in your own destruction." The sentence settled deep inside Nora. Before she could answer, footsteps thundered suddenly through the hallway. Mason entered the kitchen looking furious. "There you are." Nora stiffened immediately. Mason barely glanced at Helen. "What the hell are you telling her?" Helen calmly closed the folders. "The truth." Mason laughed bitterly. "Funny. Everybody suddenly has truth except me." Nora stared at her brother carefully. He looked exhausted. Dark circles beneath his eyes, wrinkled dress shirt, sweat glistening faintly along his temples. Not grieving, panicking. "You filed competency concerns against Dad," Nora said quietly. Mason froze. The silence answered everything. Then anger exploded across his face. "You think you know everything now?" You tried declaring him mentally unstable. He wasn't thinking clearly. Nora stared at him in disbelief. "He was dying," she whispered. "He was irrational." "No," Nora replied softly. "He just stopped giving you money." Mason slammed his fist onto the kitchen counter. "You have no idea what pressure I was under." Nora almost laughed. Pressure? Every selfish person eventually described consequences as pressure. "You know what's amazing," Nora said quietly. Mason glared at her. You all talk about Dad like he was valuable only when he was useful. That's not fair. It's exactly fair. Mason stepped closer angrily. You think you're innocent? Dad gave you everything because you manipulated him emotionally. Nora looked at him calmly now. No, she said softly. Then she delivered the sentence that finally shattered whatever remained between them. Dad gave me everything because I was the only one who loved him, without sending him an invoice afterward. Mason went completely silent, and for the first time in her life, Nora Hart did not feel guilty for telling the truth. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Sullivan Capital overlooked all of Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline in cold silver light, while executives in tailored suits sat around a polished walnut table pretending nothing was wrong. But everyone knew something was wrong. Garrett Sullivan had spent the last 48 hours desperately trying to contain disaster. Investors were asking questions, rumors were spreading, and Nora Hart had stopped answering his calls entirely. Garrett adjusted his cufflinks while forcing confidence into his posture. Control the room. Control the narrative. Control the damage. That strategy had worked his entire career, until Nora stopped cooperating. We just need temporary stability, Garrett said smoothly to the investors gathered around him. The inheritance situation complicated timing, but once certain assets become accessible, the boardroom doors opened. Every head turned instantly. Nora entered wearing black, elegant, calm, unreadable, and she wasn't alone. Helen Brooks walked beside her, so did a tall woman Garrett recognized immediately. Rebecca Klein, one of the most ruthless divorce attorneys in New York. Garrett's stomach dropped instantly. For the first time in years, genuine panic flashed across his face. Nora, he said carefully standing. What is this? Nora looked at him quietly. No apology, no hesitation, no emotional trembling. It unsettled him immediately. Rebecca placed a leather portfolio onto the conference table calmly. Good afternoon, she said professionally. I'm representing Nora Hart. The room went completely silent. Several executives exchanged nervous looks. One investor frowned. Garrett. What exactly is happening? Garrett forced a laugh. Personal marital issues are being handled privately. No, Nora said softly. Financial fraud is being handled professionally. The air shifted instantly. Garrett's expression darkened. Nora, enough. But she kept walking until she reached the opposite side of the table. For the first time in years, she positioned herself across from him instead of beside him, and Garrett noticed. Rebecca opened the portfolio. Over the last 18 months, she said calmly, Mr. Sullivan used projected inheritance expectations connected to Nora Hart to stabilize investor confidence and negotiate financial leverage. Several people immediately straightened in their seats. Garrett spoke quickly. That's an absurd distortion. Rebecca slid copies of documents across the table. Projected estate liquidity models, internal financial summaries, communication records. Nora watched investors' faces change one by one while reality settled into the room. Shock, confusion, concern. Garrett stepped toward Rebecca angrily. You obtained private files illegally. No, Nora said quietly. I found them on my husband's laptop while discovering his affair. The room froze again. Garrett turned sharply toward her. You're trying to destroy me. The sentence almost made Nora laugh now. Destroy him. As though consequences were cruelty. For years, Garrett framed accountability as emotional aggression whenever it threatened him. Now everyone else was seeing it too. An older investor near the end of the table frowned deeply. Garrett, did you actually build recovery projections around your wife's inheritance? Garrett straightened immediately. It's common for family wealth to impact long-term forecasting, Rebecca calmly responded, not before the family member dies. Silence crashed through the boardroom. Garrett looked furious now. Nora has been emotionally unstable since her father's death. There it was. The same weapon again. Emotional instability, but this time Nora was ready for it. She stepped forward slowly. My father was dying while Garrett discussed my future inheritance with another woman. Nobody moved. He built financial recovery plans around my grief. Nora's voice remained calm, and he coordinated privately with my brothers while pretending to support me publicly. The humiliation in Garrett's face slowly transformed into rage. You have no understanding of corporate pressure. Nora stared at him quietly. No, she said softly. I understand character. That landed harder than shouting ever could. One executive removed his glasses slowly. Garrett, tell me directly. Did you conceal the severity of company exposure while relying on projected marital assets? Garrett's silence lasted too long, and in business hesitation destroys confidence faster than confession. Rebecca spoke carefully. We also possess evidence suggesting attempts were made to emotionally pressure Nora Hart into liquidating inherited assets rapidly. Several people shifted uncomfortably, because now this no longer sounded like marital conflict. It sounded predatory. Garrett finally snapped. Everybody in this room leverages relationships strategically. Nora physically felt the temperature change, because that sentence revealed everything. Not love, not family, leverage. That was how Garrett viewed human connection, as leverage. One investor stared at him in disbelief. Jesus Christ. Garrett immediately realized his mistake. That's not what I meant. Yes, Nora said quietly. It is. The silence afterward felt brutal. Garrett looked at her desperately now, not lovingly, strategically, calculating whether emotional manipulation still worked. Nora, he said softer this time, don't do this publicly. Publicly? Interesting. He never seemed concerned about betrayal itself, only visibility. Nora remembered crying quietly in their penthouse bathroom after Garrett forgot her birthday dinner because of an investor event. He bought her diamond earrings the next day, not because he felt guilty, because polished appearances mattered. Everything with Garrett revolved around optics, even marriage, especially marriage. Rebecca calmly slid another document toward the investors. Mr. Sullivan's personal accounts also reveal substantial undisclosed expenditures connected to an ongoing extramarital relationship. Garrett's face drained of color. Nora? She has a name. Nora interrupted softly. Chloe Bennett. Several executives looked openly horrified now, because Garrett's image had always been immaculate, disciplined, stable, reliable, and suddenly the mask was cracking publicly. One board member rubbed his forehead slowly. This is catastrophic. Garrett turned toward Nora sharply. You're humiliating both of us? The old Nora would have crumbled hearing that. Public humiliation terrified her once, but something fundamental had changed now. She realized humiliation only works when shame belongs to the wrong person. Nora looked directly at him. You humiliated me the moment you turned my father's death into financial strategy. Garrett stared at her silently, and for the first time, he looked uncertain of how to control her. That realization empowered Nora more than revenge ever could. An investor finally spoke carefully. We need independent review immediately. Another nodded quickly. Agreed. A third added, until then, Garrett should temporarily step away from executive authority. Garrett snapped toward them. You can't be serious. But nobody defended him, because trust was already collapsing, and Garrett built his entire life on trust performance rather than integrity itself. Rebecca closed her portfolio calmly. My client will also be pursuing divorce proceedings and separate financial protections, effective immediately. The finality of it echoed through the room. Divorce. Real, now, irreversible. Garrett looked at Nora with something close to desperation. You're throwing away 8 years. Nora felt sadness then. Real sadness. Not for the marriage itself, for the woman she used to be inside it. The woman who kept shrinking herself, hoping love would finally feel safe. I spent 8 years trying to become someone easy enough for you to value, she said quietly. The room stayed completely silent, and the worst part, Nora's voice cracked slightly. You almost convinced me that was normal. Garrett looked away first. For years, Nora feared this man emotionally, needed his approval, measured herself against his moods. And now he just looked small. Rebecca touched Nora's arm gently. We should go. Nora nodded once, then she turned toward the door. Behind her, Garrett finally raised his voice. You think this makes you powerful? Nora stopped walking. The old version of herself would have turned back crying, apologizing, explaining. Instead, she answered calmly without facing him. No. Silence filled the boardroom. Then Nora delivered the sentence that finally destroyed whatever remained of Garrett Sullivan's control over her. It just means I finally stopped volunteering to be used. And this time, nobody in the room could pretend she was wrong. 3 days after the boardroom collapse, Nora received a message from Chloe Bennett. Can we meet? There's something you still don't know. Nora stared at the text for a long time without answering. Part of her wanted to block the number immediately, Not because she hated Chloe anymore, because Chloe represented the final collapse of the life Nora thought she had. The marriage, the illusion, the version of herself that kept forgiving things she should have walked away from years earlier. Outside her Manhattan hotel suite, snow drifted slowly across the city for the first time that winter. Nora watched people moving below through white streets while exhaustion settled deep into her bones. Everything hurt lately, not dramatically, quietly, like bruises pressed beneath skin. Helen had advised her not to return to the penthouse while divorce proceedings began. Garrett was still there along with lawyers, damage control consultants, and what remained of his carefully manufactured image. So Nora stayed alone instead. And for the first time in years, loneliness felt safer than marriage. Her phone buzzed again. Please. I think your father was right about Garrett. That message made Nora respond. The cafe overlooked the Hudson River. Quiet, warm, mostly empty in the middle of a snowy afternoon. Chloe sat near the windows wearing a cream-colored coat, both hands wrapped tightly around untouched tea. She looked exhausted. Not glamorous anymore, not intimidating, just emotionally wrecked. When Nora approached the table, Chloe stood awkwardly. Thank you for coming. Nora nodded once before sitting down. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Chloe quietly said, I ended things with Garrett. Nora felt surprisingly little hearing that. No triumph, no satisfaction, only sadness. Because nobody truly wins after loving someone emotionally hollow. Chloe looked down at her cup. He came to Chicago 2 nights ago. Nora's eyes lifted slightly. He was angry, Chloe admitted softly. Not heartbroken. Angry. That sounded familiar. He kept talking about reputation, Chloe continued. About how you embarrassed him publicly. Nora almost laughed. Of course. Garrett still viewed betrayal as a branding issue. He blamed me too, Chloe whispered. Said I complicated things emotionally. Emotionally. Again. The universal word men like Garrett used whenever women stopped behaving conveniently. Nora studied Chloe carefully. You really didn't know, Chloe shook her head immediately. No, I swear. And strangely, Nora believed her, because Garrett specialized in telling different versions of reality to different people. To investors, he was disciplined. To Nora, he was logical. To Chloe, he was trapped and misunderstood. Different masks, same man. Chloe reached into her purse slowly. There's more evidence. Nora's chest tightened. Chloe placed a small recorder onto the table. He left voice memos on my phone constantly. Business ideas, complaints, things he didn't want written down. Nora stared at it carefully. Why are you helping me? Chloe's eyes filled slightly. Because I finally realized something. Silence settled softly between them. I wasn't special, Chloe whispered. I was just useful. The sentence hit Nora deeply, because that was the hidden horror of manipulative people. They customize affection until every woman believes she's uniquely chosen. Then eventually both women discover neither was ever truly seen at all. Nora picked up the recorder slowly. You listened to these, Chloe nodded. One of them scared me. Nora pressed play. Garrett's voice filled the tiny cafe speaker immediately. Calm, controlled, dangerous. Mason needs to stop panicking, Garrett said. If everybody stays aligned, Nora will eventually cave emotionally. Nora froze instantly. The recording continued. She can't handle isolation long term. She needs emotional approval too much. The words physically hurt, not because they were cruel, because once upon a time they were true. Garrett knew exactly how dependent Nora used to be on keeping people happy. Another pause in the recording. Then Garrett laughed softly. Honestly, her father dying might be the best thing that ever happened financially if everyone stops acting stupid. Nora stopped breathing. The cafe disappeared around her. Snow blurred beyond the windows. People moved somewhere far away. But all Nora could hear was Garrett discussing Daniel Hart's death like a market opportunity. Chloe turned the recorder off quietly. I'm sorry. Nora stared at the table silently. Her father was right all along. Not paranoid, not emotional, protective. And suddenly Nora understood something devastating. Daniel didn't spend his final months trying to save money. He spent them trying to save her. Tears slid down Nora's face silently. Chloe reached across the table instinctively before stopping herself awkwardly. I should have seen it sooner, she whispered. Nora shook her head slowly. No, because this wasn't about intelligence. Manipulative people survive by studying emotional hunger, and Garrett studied it expertly. You know what scares me most? Nora asked quietly. Chloe looked at her. I loved him sincerely. Her voice cracked slightly. I would have defended him against anyone. Chloe lowered her eyes sadly. That's why men like him choose women like us. The sentence settled heavily between them. Not weak women. Loving women. Women trained to overextend empathy until self-abandonment felt normal. Nora suddenly remembered something her father once said after her mother died. The kindest people are often easiest to convince they deserve less. At the time, she thought he was grieving. Now she realized he was warning her. Chloe wiped beneath her eyes quietly. There's one more thing. Nora looked up slowly. He panicked the night your father died. A chill ran through Nora immediately. What do you mean? Chloe swallowed hard. He kept making calls, fighting with someone. She hesitated. I heard your brother's names. Nora's pulse quickened. What were they arguing about? I don't know exactly. Chloe looked genuinely nervous now, but Garrett kept saying the paperwork wasn't finalized yet. Paperwork, always money. Nora felt physically sick because while she was holding her father's hand during his final hours, Garrett was worried about timing, not loss. Timing. The cruelty of it hollowed her out completely. Chloe carefully pushed another item across the table, a printed screenshot. Nora looked down slowly. A text exchange. Garrett. If Daniel signs anything else, before the end we lose leverage. Mason. Then handle Nora before Helen gets involved deeper. Nora stopped breathing. Her brothers, Garrett, working together. Not fully, not cleanly, but enough. Enough to reveal what her father already knew. They weren't mourning his death, they were positioning around it. Nora leaned back slowly in her chair. Something inside her finally settled then. Not peace, finality, because the last remaining illusion died in that cafe. Family loyalty, marriage loyalty. The fantasy that if she loved people hard enough, they would eventually love her safely back. Chloe looked at her carefully. What are you going to do now? Nora stared out at the snow falling over New York, then answered quietly, for the first time in my life. She paused softly. I'm going to stop protecting people who would have destroyed me without guilt, and somewhere deep inside her grief. A stronger woman finally began emerging from the wreckage. The Connecticut estate was silent when Nora returned alone. Snow covered the long driveway in soft white layers, while gray winter light stretched across the massive property her father once filled with warmth. For the first time since Daniel Hart's death, the house belonged entirely to her, and somehow that felt less like victory and more like grief settling permanently into the walls. Nora walked slowly through the mansion, still wearing her black wool coat fingertips, brushing against familiar furniture and framed photographs as memories rose quietly around her. Her mother laughing beside the grand piano, Christmas mornings with too much cinnamon in the kitchen, Daniel carrying Nora upstairs asleep on his shoulder after long summer nights. Back then, this house felt alive. Not expensive, loved. That difference mattered now. She eventually found herself standing outside her father's study again. The same room where everything changed. The same room where she finally stopped lying to herself. Nora entered slowly. The late afternoon sun filtered weakly through tall windows while dust floated quietly in golden light. Daniel's books remained perfectly organized. His reading glasses still rested beside the leather chair where he used to sit every evening. For several seconds, Nora simply stood there breathing. Then she sat at his desk. Another envelope waited there. Helen must have placed it earlier. This one read, "When you're finally ready." Nora's chest tightened painfully, because some part of her knew what this was. Not legal documents, not evidence, something softer. More dangerous emotionally, she opened it carefully. Inside sat another handwritten note and a key. The note was short. Basement archive room. Third cabinet. Top drawer. Love you forever, sweetheart. Dad. Nora stared at the words for several long seconds before standing again. The basement archive room sat beneath the west wing of the mansion. Daniel used it for decades to store company records, family photographs, and old legal files. Nora rarely entered it growing up. As a child, the room intimidated her. Now it felt sacred. The third cabinet opened with a metallic click. Inside the top drawer sat dozens of videotapes and digital files, carefully labeled in Daniel's handwriting. Family, Evelyn, Nora. The sight nearly destroyed her, because suddenly she realized her father prepared for death by preserving love. Not wealth. Love. Nora carried one small storage box upstairs with trembling hands. Inside the study again, she loaded another video file onto the laptop. Daniel appeared on screen looking weaker than ever, but smiling. A real smile this time. "Hi, sweetheart." Nora immediately began crying again. "You found the archive?" He laughed softly before coughing. "Your mother always said I kept too many memories." Nora smiled through tears, because it was true. Daniel Hart saved everything: birthday cards, old school drawings, voicemails, photographs, proof that people existed and mattered. "I wanted to leave you something better than money," Daniel said quietly. Nora leaned closer unconsciously. "Money protects people temporarily, but knowing you were loved properly?" His eyes softened. "That protects people for life." Nora covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face, because after everything Garrett and her brothers destroyed, her father was still trying to rebuild her emotionally. Daniel shifted painfully in the hospital bed. "I know you blame yourself for staying too long." Nora froze, because he was right. Every night lately, shame haunted her. How did I miss it? How did I excuse it? Why did I keep shrinking myself for people who never deserved it? Daniel sighed softly. "Nora, loving someone sincerely is never the embarrassing part." Her chest tightened sharply. "The embarrassing part belongs to people who exploit love without respecting it." The words settled deep inside her, healing something she didn't know how to heal alone. Daniel smiled faintly again. "You know what your mother admired most about you." Nora wiped tears quietly. "She said you never learned how to become cruel after disappointment." Nora laughed softly through tears. "That worried me sometimes," Daniel admitted, "because the world rewards hard people more easily." Silence filled the study warmly. "But your mother believed soft hearts changed lives in ways power never can." Nora looked down at her trembling hands. For years, Garrett treated her softness like weakness, but Daniel and Evelyn Hart saw it differently, as strength, as humanity, as something rare. Another file sat beside the laptop labeled Evelyn Hart Foundation. Nora frowned slightly before opening it. Dozens of legal documents appeared. Incorporation records, funding structures, operational planning. Her heartbeat quickened. Then Daniel's voice spoke again from the video. "There's one final thing I need you to understand." Nora looked back up. "I didn't leave you Hart Medical Holdings just so you'd be financially secure." He smiled gently. "I left you purpose." Nora stared at the foundation documents again. The Evelyn Hart Foundation. Mission statement: supporting women recovering from emotional abuse, financial coercion, and domestic manipulation. Nora physically stopped breathing, because suddenly everything made sense. The private meetings, the hidden legal planning, the emotional urgency in Daniel's final messages. Her father knew exactly what kind of marriage she was trapped inside, and instead of humiliating her, he built her a future beyond it. Nora broke completely then. Not from pain, from love. The overwhelming grief of realizing someone saw her suffering clearly while she was still minimizing it herself. Daniel's eyes glistened on screen. "You spent your whole life taking care of everyone else, sweetheart." He smiled softly. "It's time someone took care of you." Nora cried harder than she had since the funeral, because nobody had ever loved her without conditions like that before. Not Garrett, not her brothers, not even herself. A sudden knock downstairs interrupted the silence. Nora quickly wiped her face. Another knock echoed through the mansion. Confused, she stood and walked downstairs slowly. When she opened the front door, Mason stood there, alongside Tyler and Jake. All three looked exhausted, worn down, smaller somehow. Snow covered Mason's coat shoulders, while Tyler avoided eye contact entirely. Jake looked nervous for the first time in his life. Nora stared at them silently. "What are you doing here?" Nobody answered immediately. Then Mason finally spoke. "We need help." The irony nearly knocked the air from her lungs. After everything, after the accusations, after the greed, after trying to destroy Daniel's competency legally, now they needed her. Tyler rubbed both hands across his face shakily. "Garrett's company is under investigation." Nora stayed silent. Mason lost investors too, Jake admitted quietly. Everything's collapsing. There it was. Not grief, consequences. Mason finally looked directly at Nora, and for the first time since childhood, he looked ashamed. Nora. His voice cracked slightly. We screwed up. The words echoed heavily through the massive entryway. Nora stared at her brothers carefully. These men spent years making her feel small, emotional, weak, manipulative, but standing here now, they just looked lost. And suddenly Nora understood something powerful. The people who underestimated her kindness never imagined what she would become once she stopped offering it freely. Snow fell harder outside the estate while Nora stood facing her brothers in the grand entryway. For years this moment would have broken her. Mason looking ashamed. Tyler unable to meet her eyes. Jake nervous and quiet instead of reckless and sarcastic. Once upon a time, Nora would have rushed to comfort them immediately. That version of her no longer existed. What exactly do you want from me? She asked calmly. The question echoed softly through the mansion. Mason swallowed hard. Garrett's company is collapsing fast, he admitted. Investigators are digging through everything. Nora stayed silent. Tyler finally looked up. Some of the financial connections are leading back to us. Of course they were, because greed always leaves fingerprints eventually. Jake rubbed both hands together anxiously. We didn't think things would go this far. Nora almost laughed. That sentence defines selfish people perfectly. They never imagine consequences applying to them, only benefits. Mason stepped forward slowly. We know we treated Dad badly. Nora's chest tightened painfully hearing it out loud. Not because it healed anything, because Daniel Hart deserved to hear that apology while alive. Not after death, not after legal investigations, not after financial collapse. You accused me of manipulating him, Nora said quietly. Mason lowered his eyes. We were angry. No, Nora corrected softly. You were entitled. Silence, because they knew she was right. Tyler exhaled shakily. Garrett convinced us you were controlling everything emotionally. Nora frowned slightly. Garrett Mason nodded bitterly. He kept saying you'd eventually split the inheritance if enough pressure was applied. The words settled coldly inside her chest. Even now, Garrett's manipulation continued revealing itself layer by layer. He told us you always folded emotionally when conflict got intense, Tyler admitted quietly. Nora stared at them in disbelief. Garrett studied her like a behavioral pattern, a weakness to leverage, not a wife. Jake finally looked directly at her. He made it sound like he was trying to protect all of us from you. Nora laughed softly, a hollow sound. Protect them from her, the woman who spent her entire life protecting everyone else. The irony almost hurt more than the betrayal itself. Mason stepped closer again. We should have listened to Dad. Those words nearly shattered her, because beneath all the anger, one truth remained unbearable. Daniel Hart died disappointed in his family, and no amount of regret could undo that now. You don't get to suddenly become good people because life got difficult, Nora said quietly. Mason flinched visibly. Good. For once someone else could carry discomfort instead of her. Tyler rubbed a hand across his face. We know. Nora studied them carefully, and for the first time in her life, she stopped confusing pity with responsibility. That changed everything. Before anyone could speak again, headlights swept across the front windows. A car door slammed outside, then another. Nora's stomach tightened immediately. She already knew. The front door opened before anyone reached it. Garrett walked inside, still wearing his dark wool coat, snow melting across his shoulders. He looked exhausted, unshaven, angrier than she had ever seen him, and somehow still arrogant enough to act like he belonged there. Nora, he said sharply. Jake muttered under his breath, Jesus Christ. Mason looked instantly uncomfortable. Garrett's eyes moved across the room coldly before landing back on Nora. We need to talk. No, Nora replied calmly. The immediate refusal visibly stunned him, because Garrett still wasn't fully adjusted to the fact she no longer obeyed emotional pressure automatically. This isn't optional, he said. Nora almost smiled. That tone used to terrify her. Now it just exposed him. You don't get to decide what's optional for me anymore. Garrett stepped further inside the mansion. This entire situation has spiraled because you've been manipulated emotionally by grief. There it was again. Always the same strategy. If Nora disagreed with him, she was emotional. If she defended herself, she was unstable. If she established boundaries, someone else had influenced her. Garrett could never acknowledge her autonomy without losing control over her. "You cheated on me," Nora said quietly. Garrett exhaled sharply. "We both know our marriage was broken long before Chloe." Mason and Tyler exchanged uncomfortable looks, because suddenly Garrett wasn't even pretending remorse anymore. Just justification. "You built financial projections around my father's death. I was trying to save our future. You were trying to save yourself." Garrett's jaw tightened violently. "After everything I gave you," Nora interrupted softly, "what exactly did you give me?" Silence filled the room, because Garrett genuinely didn't know how to answer that question without mentioning money, status, or lifestyle. Not love, not safety, not kindness, just resources. Nora slowly stepped toward him. "You made me feel guilty for having needs." Garrett stared at her. "You made me apologize for grief." Her voice cracked slightly now. "You treated my sensitivity like a flaw." "That's not true. You taught me to distrust my own instincts." Garrett looked furious now. "Because your instincts are emotional?" Nora almost laughed. Even now, even after everything. He still believed emotion itself made her inferior, and suddenly she saw him clearly for what he truly was. A man terrified of feelings he couldn't control. "You know what the saddest part is," Nora whispered. Garrett frowned. "I would have stayed loyal to you forever." For one brief second, something flickered across his face. Regret, maybe? Or simply the realization of what he lost. But it vanished quickly beneath defensiveness again. "You're acting like I abused you." The sentence chilled the entire room, because manipulative people always expect cruelty to count only if it leaves bruises. Nora looked at him steadily. "You convinced me my emotions made me difficult to love." Silence. That changes a person. Garrett looked away first. And somehow that small moment felt bigger than all their previous fights combined, because power had shifted permanently now. Mason quietly cleared his throat. "Maybe we should leave." Garrett snapped immediately. "No, stay." Interesting. He still wanted an audience, still wanted leverage, still wanted pressure surrounding Nora, but Nora noticed it now. Every tactic, every performance, every manipulation. And once manipulation becomes visible, it starts dying. Garrett stepped closer carefully. "Nora, listen to me." His voice softened suddenly. Familiar. Dangerously familiar. The voice he used whenever he sensed her slipping emotionally away from him. "I know I made mistakes. Mistakes. Not betrayal, not manipulation, not cruelty. Mistakes. You're overwhelmed right now," he continued softly. "Your father died. Your family's falling apart. People are poisoning you against me." Nora stared at him. There it was. The final attempt. Rewrite reality. Isolate her emotionally. Make her question herself again. But Daniel Hart spent months preparing her for this exact moment, and for the first time in her life, Nora trusted herself more than the man trying to control her. "I'm not overwhelmed anymore," she said quietly. Garrett went still. "I'm awake." Silence crashed through the room. Real fear entered Garrett's eyes then. Not fear of losing the marriage, fear of losing influence, fear of losing access, fear of losing the woman who spent years sacrificing herself to stabilize his life. Nora reached calmly into the folder beside the staircase table. Then she removed divorce papers. Garrett stared at them like he'd been physically struck. "Nora, you said I needed you," she interrupted softly. Snow swirled violently outside the windows while the mansion stood silent around them. Then Nora delivered the sentence Garrett Sullivan never imagined hearing from her. "I finally realized surviving you was harder than losing you." And without another word, she signed the papers. 6 months later, the Connecticut estate no longer felt haunted. It felt alive again. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows while soft jazz played somewhere downstairs and the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the renovated kitchen. For the first time in years, Nora Hart woke up without anxiety sitting on her chest. No walking on emotional glass. No anticipating Garrett's moods. No shrinking herself to keep other people comfortable. Just peace. Real peace. And at first, peace felt almost unfamiliar. Nora stood barefoot on the terrace overlooking the property, while early spring wind moved gently through the trees. The gardens had begun blooming again after months of winter filling the estate with color Daniel and Evelyn Hart once loved deeply. The house finally breathed differently now, not like a museum preserving appearances, like a home healing. Behind her voices echoed warmly from inside. The Evelyn Hart Foundation officially opened 3 months earlier, and somehow it had already changed hundreds of lives. Women arrived carrying invisible damage Nora recognized instantly: financial control, emotional manipulation, the exhaustion of constantly proving worth to people who benefited from their silence. Every story hurt to hear, but every story also reminded Nora she was no longer alone. Pain lost some of its power once spoken honestly. Nora. She turned, smiling softly as Helen Brooks stepped onto the terrace carrying 2 coffee mugs. You disappeared before the board meeting. Nora laughed quietly. Needed air. Helen handed her a mug. You realize your father would have cried seeing this foundation now. Nora looked back toward the estate windows. Inside, volunteers prepared for another support conference. Women moved through the halls, laughing softly while setting up resource packets and donation materials. For years, Nora thought healing meant becoming who she used to be before betrayal. Now she understood something deeper. Healing meant becoming someone new entirely. Someone who finally protected herself too. You know, Helen said gently, Daniel once told me he worried kindness would destroy you. Nora smiled faintly. He said the world teaches soft people to apologize for surviving. That sentence settled warmly inside Nora's chest, because her softness survived everything. Garrett's manipulation, her brother's betrayal, grief, humiliation, and somehow, she never became cruel. That mattered now, very deeply. A black SUV pulled slowly into the estate driveway below. Nora's stomach tightened slightly before relaxing again. Not fear anymore. Just recognition. Mason stepped out first, then Tyler, then Jake. Their lives looked very different now. Smaller, quieter, more honest. The investigations connected to Garrett destroyed several business relationships permanently. Mason lost major investments. Tyler declared partial bankruptcy. Jake entered long-term rehabilitation voluntarily after finally admitting how badly his life had spiraled. Consequences changed all of them. Not perfectly, but enough. Do you want me to tell them to leave? Helen asked carefully. Nora shook her head slowly. No, because boundaries no longer required hatred. That was another thing she finally learned. Her brothers entered the estate cautiously a few minutes later. Not entitled anymore, almost nervous. Jake noticed the foundation volunteers immediately. Wow. Nora smiled slightly. Dad left more than money. Mason looked around the restored mansion quietly. You changed the whole place. No, Nora said softly. I brought it back. Silence settled between them. Not hostile this time, just honest. Tyler finally spoke first. I heard the foundation helped over 200 women already. Nora nodded. We're expanding legal assistance programs next year. Mason lowered his eyes briefly. Dad would have loved that. The grief in his voice sounded real now. Not performative. Not strategic. Real. And somehow that made Nora sadder than anger ever did, because this version of her brothers came too late for Daniel to see. Jake rubbed his hands together awkwardly. We, brought something. He handed Nora a small storage box. Inside were old family photographs, childhood drawings, letters. Mason cleared his throat roughly. Dad kept copies at our houses, too. Nora touched one photograph carefully, a younger Daniel Hart lifting 6-year-old Nora onto his shoulders, while all 3 brothers ran laughing behind them across the beach. Back before money complicated love. Back before adulthood hardened everyone. We're trying, Tyler admitted quietly. Nora looked at them carefully, and for the first time in years, she believed they meant it. Not because they became perfect, because life finally stripped away the entitlement hiding who they were underneath. Mason swallowed hard. We know sorry doesn't fix anything. No, Nora said softly. It doesn't. Silence. But accountability matters. Mason nodded slowly, and nobody argued. That alone felt miraculous. Later that evening, after everyone left, Nora wandered upstairs toward Daniel's study again. The room remained mostly untouched, warm lighting, old books, the soft scent of cedar wood. Her father's presence still lived there somehow. Nora sat quietly in his leather chair while sunset painted gold across the walls. Then she opened the final video file she had avoided watching until now. Daniel appeared on screen, smiling faintly. "If you're watching this one," he said softly, "then I'm hoping you finally chose yourself." Nora laughed through sudden tears, because he knew her so well. Daniel leaned back carefully. "I spent too many years believing success meant providing people comfort at any cost." His eyes softened. "But your mother taught me something before she died." Nora listened quietly. She said love without respect eventually becomes grief. The sentence settled deep inside her, because that described her marriage perfectly. Daniel smiled gently again. "The strongest people are not the loudest ones, sweetheart." Nora's chest tightened. They're the people who survive betrayal, without becoming bitter enough to betray themselves afterward. Tears slid down Nora's face silently. Outside the study windows, spring sunlight flooded the estate grounds her father fought so hard to protect for her. Not because of wealth, because he wanted his daughter free. Free from manipulation. Free from emotional hunger. Free from believing she had to suffer in order to deserve love. Daniel's voice softened one final time. "You were never hard to love, Nora." Her breath caught painfully. "You were simply surrounded by people who loved selfishly." The video ended quietly, but Nora stayed sitting there for a long time afterward. Not broken anymore. Not waiting for someone else to validate her worth. Just healing. Finally healing. As evening settled over the estate, Nora walked downstairs and opened the massive front windows overlooking the gardens. Warm spring air rushed into the house immediately. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance. Laughter echoed softly from Foundation volunteers finishing work downstairs. Life. The mansion no longer felt like a monument to betrayal. It felt like a second chance. And for the first time in years, Nora Hart truly felt home inside her own life again.